Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where it's about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Quantum Leap. A great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I do love this creepy feel and aesthetic for this episode because, Ben isn't a man of faith. He believes that there is a scientific explanation for this, obviously being a priest and he's supposed to be performing an exorcism, but he's right. And what I think is so interesting about this episode too is he had because at the very least he's usually had to go through everything with Addison by his side. This is the first episode he did not have Addison's help at all because there's issues going on, so they can see Ben. They can find Ben, but they can't see him or something like that. So now it's the imaging chamber or whatever is kind of messed up. So now they can't even get to Ben to let him know hey, this is what's going on. They can't help him at all. So that is a really complicated thing in that regard for Ben. So, and obviously for him, he was happy when the doctor arrived. He's like, "Oh, thank you, a man of science." Another explanation. Yeah, we'll have to do electroshock therapy. And you're like, I don't. And it's or a lobotomy. I don't like. And as Ben, as someone from the modern times, he's like, kind of don't like those ideas either. So, but it is this thing of, obviously Ben's trying to figure out what's going on, especially because his family's putting so much faith in him. It's you're our last hope. The last priest that came in didn't even make it past the first part of the exorcism. So, but even I was kind of what is going to be the rational explanation for a lot of this stuff, the demon coming out of her and stuff like that. It wasn't until he was drinking that drink later on, I'm like, are we going to fight? At first I was like, it's something, because I didn't even think someone was purposely doing this. I was like, well, it could be something seeping into the food or something. It's I'm not like asbestos or something like that. It's seeping into something and it's making people it's making her behavior be affected the way it is. But even the doctor at a certain point had to be no, this is too much when Aunt Teresa ended up dying. Not only was she killed, her body was flung up on top of a dresser or something like that. And it's Daisy isn't strong enough to do that. So it's she was the only one in the room at the time. So it's seeming, and even Ben's whoa, are you actually starting to believe that the doctor's he's it's ignorance to believe that you kind of know all. He's this is where my understanding of things ends up kind of running out. And I did love that line from Ben where he was kind of well, I was taught to basically run through all the possibilities. He's at the Vatican? He's yes, which I think is so funny because that's kind of what the show Evil's about, trying to determine whether or not something is actual possession or is it something else. And it kind of falls in that vein, right, you got to run through the list of everything. Because Ben's kind of a Christian right now, but he's a Christian in the body of a David. If you've seen Evil, you know what I'm talking about. But I also loved, because there was also that line early on. He's possession isn't real. She's and Addison's Ben, you were literally possessing that guy right now. He's I see your point. It is kind of, it didn't even cross my mind to even think about that until that line. I was oh, that's actually a really good and poignant line. So, I thought it was also interesting too that, once again, I've never seen the original series. I've seen the smallest bits and pieces, but the fact is that they were oh yeah, Sam Beckett believed that God was kind of behind the quantum leap and stuff like that. And I was cause I guess it's right, you go where God needs you to go. It's kind of almost how I refer to the TARDIS from Doctor Who. I mean, not in the God sense, but more in the sense of you end up maybe not where you want it to go, but where you need it to go. It's there's some plan to it, which I was oh, it's interesting because I was wondering, and I wonder, did they make Ben a non-religious person just to contrast Sam, who might have been a religious person? Because I was oh, him believing that God had a plan and stuff like that. If that was the case, I was oh, that's fascinating. So I thought that was interesting. I also love Ian doing the creepy thing of maybe it was a demon. I was when Mason does that. The actor who plays Ian does that. Just like makes me think of Desire from like when you kind of get like that. It just makes me think of Desire from Sandman. So that just immediately. I also love it's like, wait, are you wearing cat ears? Like, yeah, I always keep some in my desk in case of an emergency. And I love Addison wasn't even playing with that. She was just like, yeah, emergency. She didn't even play into it. She didn't even hesitate. She was just like, emergency. Is like, no, I'm not playing your game. But obviously she's stressed about it. I even love that back and forth she has with Jen, or not even back and forth, just conversation she has with Jen about she was never going to get married because she saw what happened with her parents. Like we that was a discussion last episode we got about kind of families came up, and now she talks a little bit more about it. Like her parents are divorced, and she's like, it was so nasty. They can't even be in the same room with each other now. I think it's just like they fell so out of love. I don't remember if she said necessarily like the divorce was like that nasty, but they can't even be. So she was like, right, I'm not going to put myself through that. But she met Ben, and it's like, yeah, things kind of changed. But now she's scared, like with it, especially in a situation where at the very least she's able to help Ben through whatever thing he's going through. And now the problem is, like, for her, it feels like this is the leap that could stop him. And it's like, if he doesn't leap if he doesn't succeed, he won't be able to leap, and he's stuck. Because, once again, I don't know if that's something they ever tackled in the original series of, what if you fail? This has also been one of the few instances, well, it's not actually, well, yes, it's one of the few instances where a death actually happens, like, while Ben's there. Like, the only other instance of that was, the proposal episode with Justin Hartley, that episode when the person they were after the person they were interacting with ended up being the boss, and she killed the man that she loved. Like, that's the only other instance where like I can really think off the top of my head where someone like there was an actual death involved. So that was kind of beyond their control, and I think this kind of was as well. It's kind of sad about the Aunt Teresa thing. But I do love that, like, what started off as just kind of an exorcism thing, especially when Ben later on starts seeing stuff that's not there, and it's like, I was like, there's got to be something more to this. There's no way. Because it doesn't happen that often. It can happen, but I feel like it doesn't happen that often when you fuse supernatural and science fiction. I feel like that doesn't happen that often. I mean, I can think of a few instances maybe, but I feel like that doesn't really happen that often. So for them to kind of like view it, like bring in some like, but I think maybe that's an interesting contrast, bringing in fate in a science fiction based show, because like even though it's sci-fi, it's still rooted in science, and that's the age old like battle and debate. Once again, some people can find themselves in the middle of like explaining science with their faith, that basically science doesn't denounce God in their eyes or something like that, or doesn't prove the non-existence of God. Like, so some people can find the balance. Other people are like on one side, like either all science, no faith, or all faith, no science, or once again, like you could be somewhere in between. So I just think that's kind of an interesting thing. That could be kind of what they're kind of like bringing into the mold of this episode. Like I said, also, if Sam was the religious person believing God that was or at least played a role in. I mean, maybe he wasn't even religious. Maybe it was just a thing of maybe he just started to believe that God was part of the reason behind the leaps and stuff. Like I said, it could just be an interesting contrast with Ben not being a man of faith. So. And I even love that. It's like, right, he even talks to himself later on because he's like, well, he doesn't have Addison to talk to. So he talks to the guy he's actually possessed. And it's like, I'm not a man of faith, but you are. And maybe it's about extending outside your box, especially when Daisy is. She believes, it's like, I know you're my angel. You're here to save me, because she believes wholeheartedly. And I think at the end of the day, that's what matters. Especially, but then like I said, I like that it adds that element to the episode. It is like an exorcist episode, but it also turns into a bit of a murder mystery, of like a bit of a whodunit, when it's like Ben being like, all right, there's got to be more to it. Especially when you find out like the maid, she was leaving fish under the bed, like that's where the smell was coming from. But it's a Jewish thing of leaving, like I think it's supposed to kind of absorb the evil. The fresher the fish, the better. I wonder, because it's such a small thing, but I'm also like the fact that she's like, yeah, my Daisy's father doesn't want her doing that, like bringing anything down that would have been like. So part of me was almost like well, it's during the Great Depression, and I don't know if like the hate for Jewish people was because it's like because the Great Depression was like, I know it started like, I think it's like 1934, right? Because I know it starts in 29. I only know that because like a video game, Shadow Hearts from the New World, because it takes place during the Great Depression. But yeah, I was like, I don't know if the Jewish, like, anti-Semitism, like, really started yet, because that doesn't happen until, like, I don't, it might have been already, I mean, that might have, that's why I'm just wondering, like, is that just, like, a little taste of that, just the fact that she's like, oh, I don't want you putting all this Jewish stuff up around, like, I don't know. I might be reading too much into that, but she was like, yeah, he doesn't like me doing it, so I don't know if that's supposed to be just kind of a little bit of like that's happening in the background in this era, or that once again it's just me. I mean, it's not too far into the future where it's the world, not just the world, like obviously like Nazi Germany is like, eventually going to rise to power to be, so that's why I'm like, that's why I feel like there's got to be more to that. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but they start suspecting her, but she was like, no, I would never do anything to hurt Daisy. And so it's like, right. And so, but once again, it's the explanation of, well, I love what finally like made Ben look at this, like, wait, there's got to be something more here, when he ends up getting attacked and he basses out and he runs into Addison. But I guess it's like his subconscious telling him like, no, there's got to be more going on here. It's like, wait, he's like, we've been drugged. And now it's like, right, because he remembers the gin and he's like, what's going on here? And it's like, okay, so me and Daisy have been hallucinating. So, because especially when it came to like the maid, when she came in and her eyes just started bleeding, like obviously like she wasn't feeling that. It was just the fact is only Ben was seeing it. That was kind of a clue of like, yeah, something's off here. So he starts piecing it together, like, but it's like, who could it have been? It's like, well, doesn't believe it was maid, doesn't believe it was the doctor because the doctor doesn't have the motive. The mom couldn't have done it because at the time of Aunt Teresa's death, she was sitting right beside me. So it's between Daisy's dad and her uncle. So it's like, who would have benefited from it? At first it seemed like it's the dad because he wanted because he was cut out of the will. But later on, talking to the maid, he found out that, like, right, the father didn't want any of, like, he was kind of like, he was too prideful to take her money. So she's like, fine, you won't get a cent of it. So it's like, right, who does benefit from it after that, though? The uncle, which I kept the entire episode, I was like, why does that uncle look so familiar? I looked it up, it's Josh Myers, Seth Meyers' brother. I was like, oh, okay, cool. I was like, I was wondering why he looks so familiar. And now I see that, I'm like, oh, that's super obvious. Either way, but I love the twist of, the development at first of like, right, getting the maid's help and even the doctor's help and even Daisy, like, for her having to figure out, like, wait, she's like, wait, my uncle? No, he wouldn't do that. It's like, that's what it is. He's been poisoning, he plans on killing you. And she's like, I rather believe that it's the demon. I was like, yeah, that's easier than believing, like, yeah, your own uncle is doing this to you, like, hurting you like this, and murdered your Aunt Teresa. So it's like, it's understandable why, like, I was like, that's actually really, really sad. So they all kind of worked together, and the other three were left out of it. Obviously wanted to kind of get the uncle to confess to what he did, so they put on this whole performance, and it scared the living crap out of him. What I wasn't expecting is the twist of the mother was involved. I was like, what? I was like, now that's a good last minute twist of like, of course she was involved in this. And he's like, and I love the husband saying the line of like, wow, you always were a great. And she's like, oh, shut up. For her, it's like so many choices in her life weren't her own. The fact is she was going to live her dream, but then she got pregnant and had to abandon it all, had to marry the man that she didn't necessarily want to marry. So she needed that money because she wanted to use this as an opportunity to return to her career. She wanted to be an actress. That's always what she wanted to be, and life kind of didn't go the route she did want it. And it's like, wow, you were willing to poison your own daughter to do that. That's heartbreaking. And then it's like, and the uncle was like, please forgive me, Father. He's like, I'm not the one who can give you forgiveness. And then Daisy's there, and it's like, I forgive you. Her mom's like, what? After everything I've done, you would forgive me? And she's like, because that's what I believe. I was like, you are a better person. Like, I was like, wow. I mean, the argument could be like she kind of has to, because the reality and just accepting it as it is, like holy, like how do you deal with knowing like your own mother was part of the plot to not only make you seem crazy but eventually killing you just for the money? Is it bad enough when it was your uncle? It's even worse when it's your own mother. It's like, oh, you gave, because it almost sounds like because the way, like, she obviously, like, she feels bad because now she's almost like, I did this to my baby, it's like, yeah, it's like, and especially for Daisy, because it's almost like yeah, I was such a burden on you that I was your dream killer, and you try to kill me for it, essentially. Because that was also the reason why Ben was like, there's no way, like, she's like, oh, could this be God's punishment? It's like, he's like, yeah, I don't think God's going to dish out this punishment. Like, wait 18 years to dish out the punishment. It's like, right, the timing was too convenient. But now it's like even sadder. Like, that line is even sadder now because she made that, well, what if it's God's punishment? It's like, yeah, what punishment will God have for you? I mean, I guess this is the ultimate punishment of, like, the fact is you tried to kill your daughter and she forgives you. Now it makes you feel like the rotten person you are. It's like, Jesus. And it's like, yo, your daughter might forgive you, but you're still under arrest, both of you, for what you've done. So how that family bounces back from that, and is at the worst possible time? Because this is all about this is all a byproduct, because the uncle, like, took all, like, the family's money because it was a sure thing, and then obviously the Great Depression happened. He couldn't have seen that coming, but still, it's like, man, that's rough. But what's also interesting, though, is on some level, Daisy was able to see Ben, because she was like, yeah, I saw my angel. It's like, but he had brown hair, and he was younger than you. And he was almost like, wait, what? And she's like, you gotta go, right? He was almost like, wait, what? And she's like, back to Baltimore. And he's like, oh, yeah, of course. Because she's gonna donate the money to, like, a charity and stuff like that. And she's like, oh, I'm gonna create something. And it's like, oh, you're gonna call it? She's like, oh, Goodwill. And he's like, yeah, I think that's gonna be a success. I was like, I am curious, like, how much of that is probably not a true story, but I'm curious, like, is Daisy actually, like, that family circumstances, like, maybe it is, like, yes, the story was, you take history and you kind of warp it just for the sake of a story, but I am curious, like, if her family is if she is the one who will eventually make Goodwill. I don't know. That's interesting. And I think it kind of fits with her being the person that she is, someone of faith, and just kind of, like, wanting to do good with that money, and the money that, once again, her a family member was murdered over, you were nearly murdered for, so. But also, I said Ben kind of had no assistance from Addison. It's like, right, it was a manifestation of his subconscious, but Addison still came through for him in the end, so I thought that was interesting. It's like, he mainly didn't have Madison's, but it's still an episode where he mainly didn't have Madison's help, which made it even harder, We do have that thing at the end where it's like Janice is the reason why, because the moment Ian was like, he finally kind of discovered what was wrong with the machine, and I figured Janice had to be behind it, because at one point when he was talking to, was it Aunt Teresa in the hall, if you look, they made a point of, there's a shadow behind him that kind of moves independently, and it had, like, longer hair, like it looked like it might have been like a woman's shadow, and I was like, is that Janice trying to get through? Like, at first I thought she might have been also responsible for some of the wacky dude stuff that's happening, but it's like, no. Or she's been trying to get to Ben. I wonder, I'm curious if some of the times he saw that monster in the shadows and stuff like that, it was him being under the influence of it, the Jimson weed, and that in actuality that he was seeing Janice, but he was under, like, he was hallucinating, so he couldn't really see her, but she's been reaching out to him, she's trying to warn him, and you're like, warn him about what? I'm about to say, like, her and Ben already accounted for him not remembering thing. They knew that was going to be, there was a really good chance of that. So I was like, did they not account for that? And it's like, no, they did. So what that was about, what she's trying to warn him about, and the fact that she went out of her way to cut communications with the others, like, maybe there's someone amongst that group. It's like, maybe you can't fully trust, maybe that's why you did this, because you knew there was someone, a traitor amongst the Quantum Leap team, that someone you couldn't trust. So that's why you went to someone outside of it, because you didn't, which I hope that's not the case, because it's the most heartbreaking thing if it turns out that is the reason, because, for Addison, it'll be like, wait, you couldn't even trust me with this? It's like, it might turn into that type of situation. We'll have to wait and see whether it's that or whether it's something else that because we do know that there is our Leaper X introduced the last episode, so there's some elements to this. I'm curious to see where they kind of go with that. There's also this quick little thing I should also note. The thing I kept wondering is like, how do you know like time has changed and stuff like that? Like, how do you protect yourself from like time overriding it? I guess this universe just has different rules because of the way maybe the quantum leaping works. But like, there was like the Reddit thing that Ian was on looking at the whole case and everything. Well, the moment Ben solved everything, it's like, oh, the page turned into an error page. Because like, oh, this page that cannot be found or doesn't exist. So it's like, okay, so they remember what was before. Like, that was the thing I was unclear about. Like, how do you balance that? It must be specifically how quantum leaping works in this universe, like how the time travel works in this universe, that makes it so if you're aware of the original history and or will it be it can't, because my thought was like, could it also be that eventually your memories of the original timeline fade as the new timeline sets in, so they won't remember everything Ben's done? But I think it's like, no, they probably will remember everything. As long, if you had the knowledge of the previous timeline, or maybe there's something with this program that everyone involved went through something to make it so that they all remember. Everyone on the outside won't remember, but if you're on the inside, you will. I don't know. I'm that because I've never seen. I mean, because I've seen like, oh, like you remember things, like people remembering the original timeline and the new timeline. I've seen instances of that, but usually that creates an issue because I mean, I guess it just depends on the series. Because I know I want to say it was 12 Monkeys. Like obviously, like the timeline changing had a massive effect on people because people was like getting massive headaches and their nose would start bleeding. But I want to say, was it 12 Monkeys or was it like Eureka, where it's like having two timelines in your head? I don't think it was Eureka. Maybe there was just one thing where it was like multiple timelines in your head actually led to some issues where you would it was basically too much for a person's mind to handle and it was killing them. I don't know. That might have been the 12 Monkeys thing. I don't specifically the show. I don't know. Maybe I'm like connecting that to something else. I just feel like that'd be too much for the human mind to handle. But either way, we got our setup for the next leap at the end of this episode. And Ben's like, wait, and when they're like, come on, Ben, he's like, wait, you know me? I'm like, wait, I was like, there's no way Ben's actually inside of his own body, right? It's like, well, it turns out, no, it's not. It's like, okay. And they're escaping some youth academy. He's like, wait, we're running away from school. So what that all ends up being, what Janice was trying to warn Ben about, we'll ultimately have to wait to see where the next episode takes us going forward with all of this. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.